us. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Gal and folks from Haruv, who are my good colleagues. Always a pleasure to work along with them. So today we have a lot of things to talk about, and 40 minutes is not that long, so we will try to stick with the time, but at the same time, I'll try to make sure that we keep time for questions and answers at the end. So we're going to be talking about working with LGBTQ youth, what social workers need to know to practice confidently. And as I said, we have a lot of information. So kind of this is our agenda, a little bit of intro to the topic. We're going to talk about language that I think is really important for people to know. We're going to talk about disclosure coming out, a little bit about assessment of LGBTQ young people, some recommendations for competent practice, and then at the end, some resources and some references so that you can check out things online and so that you have some references that you can read afterwards. I think it's really important that what we're doing is just kind of literally the slip off the top of an iceberg. There's so much more, and it's really important that people know that there's lots more information out there. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about language. And I think that sometimes people, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about politically correct language. I'm talking about language that comes from the people who have lived the experience themselves. The language that I think sometimes people are always a little bit uncomfortable with, and is that the right word? Is that not the right word? Have things changed? And language is very fluid. It's changing all the time. So what I'm going to give you is some language that I think is important to consider and think about. The first thing is this idea of LGBTQ, which we say all the time. And I think it's really important that people know what each of those letters stand for, but also that people say LGBTQ and don't just say LGBTQ, you know, whatever. I've heard people say that, and to some extent that's really disrespectful to young people. So you want to make sure that if you are going to use that acronym, that you do say LGBTQ kind of with some fluidity. It really stands for, it's an acronym for different identities. And, you know, whenever we lump people together, and there is a common root of oppression that they all share, but each one of these areas is very different. So I'll give you a little bit of a definition about each, which I think is important. I just want to also point towards the idea that sexual orientation is different from gender identity expression. That's sometimes abbreviated in another acronym, SOGI. Not that important that you remember it, but I think it's important to know that sexual orientation is very different from gender identity expression. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm talking fast because I know we have a lot to cover, and I am from New York, so we tend to talk fast anyway. This is a quick and dirty definition of sexual orientation. How a person describes their emotional and sexual attraction to others from a physical, fantasy, fit, and behavioral sense. It's not just about the physical aspect that one engages in sexually, but it also has to do with what's going on in your head, what's going on inside, and kind of behaviorally how one sees themselves. Sexual orientation is also heterosexuality, homosexuality. So it's not just about LGBTQ folks, but just important that we know kind of a grounding definition of orientation. These are the terms that I'll be talking about. I won't be talking about too much about asexual sexual orientation, but I will be talking about, whoops, went too fast there, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. Asexual is important because there are some young people that are, that just don't engage in any kind of sexuality, and I think it's important to talk about that and mention that. Gender identity expression, this is a definition of that, a term that refers to the way in which we manifest masculinity or femininity, an extension of our gender identity, the sense of being male, female, or some other gender. And that's important because lots of young people nowadays are not identifying as a binary of male or female, but something else. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about non-binary young people. Again, a little bit about gender identity expression, the way that we dress, the way that we style our hair, the way that we stand, our appearance, our speech, our behavior. These are all signals of a gender identity expression. And usually it's around one's masculinity or femininity. This starts in utero. When we know somebody's having a baby and it's going to be a boy baby, we buy something blue. And when we know somebody's having a girl baby and we're invited to something, we buy something pink. And if we don't know, we buy yellow or white or green. You know, it starts very, very early. But again, some young people don't identify in that binary, and we will mention that a bit. These are some of the the gender identity terms that I think are important sorry about that, important to think about. Trans or transgender, gender expansive, cisgender, and non-binary. The definition for heterosexual is what, 90% of people are, more or less identify as heterosexual. They are women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to men, and men who are emotionally and sexually attracted to women. Again, from a physical, fantasy, fit, and behavioral sense. We know that. The idea, though, is that when you're working with LGBTQ young people, is a lot of times we assume all young people are heterosexually oriented, and that does not fit for kids who identify as gay, lesbian, bi, or trans. I always put this term out there because a lot of times in schools of social work, people kind of, maybe we've changed a little bit, which I hope we have talked about folks who are homosexual. And this is an old word that comes from the Greek prefix homo, meaning same, and the Latin root meaning of sex, meaning sex. And it is a term that was invented in 1869 by the Austrian writer Carl Maria Kirkbenny. He coined this term. I always say that this is a term that I would urge people not to use. I don't think it's not a negative term, it's not a slur, it's just an outmoded term that is used by others to define the LGBTQ community. It's a word that has pathologically based overtones and associations because prior to 1973, if you were diagnosed as homosexual, you were mentally ill. And it was deleted from DSM in 1973, but I think it's really important to remember that history. And the preferred terms that most people use nowadays are gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, which stress cultural and social matters, not just sexual matters. So again, if you're working with young people in particular, young people are not calling themselves homosexuals. And I would just urge you to avoid using that word. There are other words that are more appropriate. This is one, gay. Again, gay is an important word that talks about emotional and sexual attraction to people of their own gender. The same thing, fantasy, fit, behavioral, and physical sense. It's most commonly used when talking about young men. It is a term that's been used by the community to define itself after the Stonewall riots of 1969, which happened in New York City. And it was the time at which people stopped using the term homosexual and started using terms like gay pride, gay liberation, gay power, and gay folks themselves started to use this term. A lot of times people think of it as a slang term, but it's not. Most folks nowadays use the term gay to define their identity. Women use it too. And I think, again, it's not like we're the politically correct police. Basically, if young people use gay and they're a female or a male child, it doesn't matter. I think people need to use the terms they feel comfortable with. I like to give people terms because I think it's important that social workers can comfortably say these terms as well. Bi or bisexuality describes a person who has the capacity to be emotionally and sexually attracted to women and to men from the same situations that we mentioned. It is a legitimate sexual orientation, but it's also sometimes used as a transitional term, which acts as a bridge from heterosexuality to a gay, lesbian, or trans identity. So I think for young people, when they say I'm bi, sometimes 3 months later, 2 months later, 2 days later, they'll say, well, I'm not really bi, I'm really gay. Or I'm not gay, I'm not bi, I'm straight, whichever. I think they sometimes use that term bisexual as a transitional period. I don't think that bisexuality is transitional, but I think it's important to know that sometimes young people and sometimes adults who are coming out will prefer to use the term bi before they claim another identity. It's kind of like, well, you're half heterosexually oriented, and maybe that's different than being fully gay. Again, it's an important term for young people just to kind of offer it as an option. Lesbian is an older term derived from the Greek island of Lesbos, where the poet Sappho wrote about her love for women. My students in social work school always tell me, Gary, you cannot say that Sappho was a lesbian. We have no evidence to say she was a lesbian, and they're right, we don't. But we do know that the term lesbian comes from the island of Lesbos, where the poet Sappho did write about her love for women. It is the same kind of thing where it describes women who are emotionally and sexually attracted to other women. sometimes some young women do not like this term. They use gay. Some other young women will even use the term dyke, which I don't have in my stack here. I think that's one of those in-group words where if a young person uses it to define their identity, you can talk about it with them, but it's not a word that I would urge you to use first. It's one of those formerly negative words that have been reclaimed. But again, it's all about, kind of meeting the client where they're at, which is what we keep telling people in social work, right? The next term is a kind of a complicated term, questioning, and that's the Q in LGBTQ. These are three groups of young people that I see. Young people who are going through a phase of kind of experimentation. It might be situational LGBT identification. They're in an all-boys school, they're in an all-girl group home. They're checking things out. That's one group of young people who might be questioning. The other group are young people who've survived sexual abuse, usually without treatment, usually same-gendered sexual abuse. And I want to be really clear about the fact that you cannot become lesbian, gay, bi, or trans by being sexually abused, but you can become very confused about your gender identity or your sexual orientation if you have experienced sexual abuse as a child by an adult. Those young people need two forms of treatment, not treatment, but two forms of intervention in the sense of checking out where they're at with respect to sexual orientation and how comfortable they feel with themselves, and dealing with the trauma of the sexual abuse that they've experienced. Young people will assume responsibility for the sexual abuse, even though it really is the responsibility of the adult, not the young person. So it's a complicated factor, but I've worked with lots of young people, and maybe you have too, who have had some kind of, especially same-gendered sexual abuse, and then they will say, I think they made me gay because of that. So again, I would call those young people questioning and kind of talk through kind of what their feelings were about that experience, and kind of really focus more on, dealing with the trauma of sexual abuse than worrying about where they were at with respect to sexual orientation. The last group of questioning young people are young people who are, maybe have a characterological disorder, who will, personality disorder, that will have some serious psychiatric illness and claim a lesbian, gay, bi, or trans identity, but really are not of that community. Lots of different examples of this as well. Sometimes young people will see LGBTQ people getting special attention and will ask for, well, why can't I get that attention? And, and other things that are much more serious than that. But that's the cluster of young people that I would think of as being questioning around their sexual orientation. Sexual fluidity is something, to be honest with you, that I've had students talk with me about for a long time. This is really people who do not identify as gay or lesbian or bi, but will say, I'm just attracted to people whom I'm attracted to, and I don't use any of those terms to talk about my life. People who have high sexual fluidity don't fit the labels of bisexual, heterosexual, or gay or lesbian. They say that their orientation is fluid, that it's interchangeable, and that it's not possible to pinpoint or name their orientation. And I'm putting this out there because more commonly in the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a lot of young people who will say, I do not identify with this binary scheme of male or female or gay or lesbian. I really am attracted to people whom I'm attracted to. And they don't use any of those terms to define themselves. A little bit complicated, probably requires further discussion than what we have time for, but I wanted to put it out there because I think a lot of young people are beginning to kind of talk in those terms, and people need to know that. Non-binary identity is very similar in some ways. Young people who don't identify as male or female, sometimes these young people are transgendered, which we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes they're not. They will say, I don't see myself as male or female. I see myself as something else. I don't identify with either of those extremes of male or female. I think, again, this is something that, when I first started in this work back in the late 80s, there was no such thing as non-binary identity. We were not working with young people like that, but in the more recent years, I hear young people more and more talking to me and telling me that they really identify as non-binary, and therefore it's really important that you know about that. And there's lots about this on the internet if you want to read more about it. But this idea of not identifying as the binary of male or female, but something else. Trans folks, and I think that we've short shrift transgender young people by kind of clumping everything together with LGBTQ, and I am, you know, we're doing that today again, but I hope that we'll have other opportunities to talk more directly about transgender young people. But it's really an umbrella term that describes people whose gender identity or expression differs from that is associated with their birth or assigned sex or a binary gender system. You know, we used to have lots of young people that use lots of different terms to talk about being trans, but nowadays we talk about having an assigned sex at birth that differs from what the young person inside knows that they are, their affirmed gender. And technically, from a DSM perspective, we used to use the category of gender identity disorder, GID. That has changed now to gender dysphoria, which is the more appropriate and clinically appropriate term for somebody who identifies as transgender. It describes a condition in which somebody is intensely uncomfortable with their biological gender and strongly identifies and wants to be in an affirmed gender that differs from the one that they were assigned at birth. Again, a little more complicated than maybe we have time to talk about, but I think it's really important to know that there are young people that we're working with increasingly that are identifying not as gay, not as bi, not as lesbian, but as transgender. And it's a very different phenomenon. I mean, basically in a nutshell, and believe me, this is just a very superficial treatment. A transgender man is somebody who was assigned female at birth and has a male gender identity, but would affirm their gender as a male. They are born female, but live as a male. And similarly for a trans woman, somebody who is assigned male at birth, but has a female gender identity. And again, this is very superficial because there are lots of people nowadays who are trans identified that do not use that M to F or F to M term, and I want to be respectful of that. But just in terms of understanding where people might be, it gives us a little kind of grounding in where people might be. Again, non-binary individuals, some of whom identify as trans. Not all non-binary people identify as trans, but I find young people, lots of young people who do. They are somebody who is neither male or female, or is a combination of being male or female. And a lot of those young people will just say, I'm non-binary. And some people who are trans-identified, who identify as non-binary, will say, I'm just trans. I don't identify as M to F or F to M. Cisgender people, and that's really an important term too, and again, an emerging one, and one that I didn't talk about a lot, but I find myself, as I'm doing these trainings, and I've been doing them for like 30 years or more, I have to keep changing my language because it's just not keeping up sometimes with what people are talking about. So cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. The term is sometimes abbreviated to be simply cis. For example, someone who identifies as a woman and is assigned female at birth is a cisgender woman. Correspondingly, someone who is identified as a man and was assigned male at birth is a cisgender man. Again, you might say, why do we even need to call it that? But the reality is that people are using those terms. I think it's important as professionals that we know what these terms are and that we know where to go to get more information about them, because these are terms that young people are using very fluidly all the time. Queer is an umbrella term that's used by some LGBTQ people to refer to the entire LGBTQ community. It's an alternative to the other labels that we have. It's an in-group word that used to be considered offensive and pejoratory, but nowadays young people are beginning to use it to define their community. And also, to some extent, being queer does not necessarily mean you're gay. There can be like queer theater and queer drama and queer art. It's kind of like a mindset But again, I'm putting it out there because young people sometimes do use this term, and I think it's important that it's not something where they're putting themselves down. It's just kind of one of those in-group words. And what I always say when young people say I'm queer, I'll say, well, tell me a little bit about what that means for you. You know, why are you using that term to identify yourself and not some other term? Just to kind of get the conversation going. Coming out and being found out is like another huge area of being a gay, lesbian, bi, or trans young person. Heterosexually oriented people don't have to come out. The assumption is they are already heterosexually oriented. I want to mention one other thing. A lot of times, you know, we talk like this is all about sex, and it is to some extent, but LGBTQ young people can also be not sexually active, but still know that they're gay, lesbian, bi, or trans. Just like some heterosexually oriented young people can not be actively engaged in sexual behavior and they know they're heterosexually oriented. So just as a point of reference. Coming out is a process of acknowledging one's sexual orientation and or gender identity, first to one's own self and then to other people. And for most LGBTQ people, this is a lifelong process. It's not a one-time event. It happens all the time. As a gay person myself, I frequently, this summer walked on the Camino, and you know, I'm married and I have a wedding ring, and people would frequently say to me when I was on the Camino, what does your wife do? Or what does your wife think about you going on the Camino? And I would say, well, I don't have a wife, I have a husband, and he's not so thrilled that I'm away for a month. Because you know, the process of coming out is something that happens all the time. I could have not said that if I chose to, but you know, I'm a fairly openly gay person, and it just is not wasn't appropriate to not address it. But it is a way of having to come out multiple times. Disclosure, which is the technical term for coming out, and a term I would urge people to use, is the point at which an LGBTQ person openly acknowledges their sexual gender orientation, again, first to themselves and then to others. And the reason I'm saying disclosure is important because it's not appropriate to use terms like discovered, admitted, revealed, found out, declared. I hear people sometimes saying that. I know they don't mean them to be pejorative, but they can be interpreted as pejorative because being discovered or revealed sounds very cloaked and kind of negative. So when someone comes out to you, they are disclosing their gay or lesbian or bi or trans identity. It's a good term to know about. There are two ways of coming out. There are two parts of it, internal and external. The internal stages of coming out, I always think from a clinical perspective, are really dangerous. There are times for young people that are fraught with lots of anxiety and lots of fear and a lot of like, I'm not telling anybody until I'm positive it's safe to tell people. So if you see there in pre-stage 1, there's no thought about your gender or sexual orientation, it's presumed that you're heterosexually oriented. That's what most people deal with. Stage 1 is, could I be gay? No, I'm not. You know, immediately saying I'm not. Stage 2 is, suppose I was LGBTQ, maybe I'll explore it, maybe I will, I'm not gonna tell anybody, but let me look online. There's so much information online about identity and sexual orientation now, good to know about. Stage 3 is, I think I might be, and maybe I need to tell one safe person. And I always think that's so important for social workers because maybe you're the one safe person. Because most LGBTQ kids, when they come out, and young people are coming out, they can come out at any point in the life cycle. I've met and worked with kids who are 10 who've been out, and I've worked with adults who are 75 and just coming out. So at any point in the life cycle, people can come out. But we're seeing that young people do come out earlier and earlier. 10 is not so outrageously early. Most kids don't come out at 10. You're seeing more like 12, 13, 14. It used to be, though, when kids went away to college, they came out. So they are coming out earlier. But again, this internal stage is, you know, young people keeping it all to themselves, looking online maybe, and then that one safe person that they want to come out to is so critical. And if it's you that they come out to, it means they've trusted you, it means you're safe, and hopefully you have what you need to kind of move that conversation forward, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. These are the external stages of coming out, a little less dangerous. Stage 4 is I think I'm beginning to deal with the fact that I am LGBTQ. And in my own time, I think I'll start sharing this news with other safe people. Safety is huge. Young people who are gay, lesbian, bi, or trans are constantly scanning their environment for safety. Even as an adult, I do it. I'm not afraid I'm going to get attacked per se, but I'm afraid, sometimes you have fear about, it might be only one, like what are people going to say, you know, how safe is it for me to be comfortable about who I am? And again, translate that into like a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, you know, maybe a kid in foster care who needs to come out and is wondering if they should come out to their counselor or their social worker or their foster parents, or think of it as a kid in a youth center who is, you know, going to come out. And believe me, I don't know how many therapists we have on the line, but I've worked with therapists where, you know, it's after 5 seconds of them talking to me about a kid that they're working with, I think, have you explored gender identity or sexual orientation? And a lot of times therapists I've worked with have said, oh no, that's not the issue. Well, how do you know? Have you really explored it? Oh, well, no, I don't think it is. And then only, you know, 5 or 6 months later for them to come back and say, you know what, this kid is gay. He came out to me last week, blah, blah, blah. What should I read? What should I look at? You know, I think, you know, it is quite possible that young people are dealing with this in ways that they're not talking to their therapist about, not talking to their social workers about. And, you know, again, these stages, you know, stage theory is not real. Nobody lives in a stage, but these are just common elements that we sometimes might see. Stage 5 is, I think, I'm out to safe and important people in my life. And stage 6 is I am LGBTQ and it's an integrated part of my identity. I'm out in environments where I feel safe and to people with whom I feel safe. Again, safety is huge. People come out differently. Not everyone's out to everybody. When I first came out to a friend, and then I came out to my sister, and then I came out to my mother, and then I came out to more friends, and I kind of built a platform where people were accepting, hopefully, and where they gave me good feedback. I didn't tell everybody at once. It took me a while to come out. It's a whole process. And again, translate that into what does this 13, 14-year-old look like? And we'll talk a little bit about issues of confidentiality, because that's a big thing. I just recently read a narrative where a kid came out to his guidance counselor in school, first person they came out to, and the guidance counselor picked up the phone and called the mother and told the mother the kid was a lesbian. It's like, that's one of the worst things that could possibly happen, because that young person was not ready to talk to their parent about it. They were only ready to talk to the guidance counselor about it. And there are issues of confidentiality and safety and privacy, but you know, and there are ways of addressing that. I'm not saying you shouldn't ever talk to the parents about it, but that's something that you would talk to parents about in consultation with the young person and supporting the young person, and not like the same day maybe. So we'll talk about that in a bit. The process of being found out, which is different, that's not when it's a planned disclosure. That's when the young person has an unplanned or surprise disclosure. And I always say it's like when it occurs on phone calls, emails, texts, letters, LGBT-related material, like a card from an LGBT youth group that the kid has in their pants pocket, and when somebody's doing the laundry at home, they find this LGBTQ youth card and say, what is this? When the kid is found out rather than coming out, this is clearly, for the most part, although there are exceptions, a family system in crisis. And I always say, do professionals know how to preserve this type of a family? Because a lot of times families initially freak out. They will, if the kid's in therapy, they're calling the therapist and they want the therapist to like deal with this and make sure that the kid addresses it and is not gay anymore. And, you know, they would love to be able to send them to some kind of rehab center. There is no such place. Actually, there are horrible places that do what they call reparative therapy, which are being outlawed across the country, because that is definitely not an intervention that should ever be utilized or works. But usually it's a family that has some serious concerns, as most families would when they have new information that's provided to them. So again, being found out is different. Just talking a little bit about the assessment is, these are some of the major clinical issues for many, not all LGBTQ kids have clinical issues. I think families and young people have some of these issues. But the reality is that I don't want to give the impression that if you're gay, you have, you know, these mental health issues. I think all of us have mental health issues to some degree or another, but these are the ones that more commonly manifest themselves. Anxiety, obviously, because you're hiding and you're fearful and you're worried and you're keeping a secret. Depression, because the mood of, keeping things under wraps and not being able to talk to somebody and feeling extremely isolated are real. Issues about coming out. I want to come out to my family. I feel so inauthentic. I feel like I've developed this false sense of who I am. I don't want to live like that anymore. I can't tell my friends. I want to be able to be who I am. I want to come out. School problems, obviously. Bullying, harassment are enormous for kids who are LGBTQ or perceived to be LGBTQ. And then family problems, just in general. Moms are a little bit more accepting of LGBTQ kids than dads are. Parents do not get told first. Sometimes siblings do, often friends do. But there's just family issues, depending on whether the family is religious or not. The reality is there are LGBTQ people in every family, every church, every synagogue, every temple, every mosque, every culture, every class. The reality is some places talk about it more, some don't. And the family configuration is probably different depending on the cultural manifestation of where you come from. Geography is another one. Like, where do you live? If you do intake, it's like, why was this young person referred? Based on intake questions, could you look at gender identity expression or sexual orientation as an issue? How do you explore these if you do? What can you do to suggest it's safe for you to talk about these issues? Those are important. Just one little other point I want to make about that, my slide was going by itself, is that I think when you talk about, working with teenagers are, sexuality is a big thing for teenagers. And if you ask teenagers if they're sexually active, you really should say, are you sexually active with boys or with girls or with both or by yourself? I've learned that one recently. So again, if you are talking about sexuality in that sense, you may need to think about some of those ways that we talk about it. Formulating an assessment, use of language. There are no cues from them. The cues come from you. That means you're the one that needs to say, I'm okay with anything you want to talk with me about. Using language, for instance, when we throw things out to young people, it doesn't matter what the issue is. We have young people who are dealing with, abuse in their home. We have young people who are dealing with, wondering about their family situation. We have young people who are gay. We have young people who are lesbian. We have young people who are bi. Those kind of things, saying those words are really important because young people are listening for you to say them. How do you create an LGBTQ affirming environment? Just having things in your office, a pink triangle, a book in your bookshelf, a sign on your wall. I think it's really important for people to assess their own level of comfort with LGBTQ people. You got to really look at that and say, okay, what makes me uncomfortable? What doesn't make me uncomfortable? What do I know? What don't I know? And make sure you have a good working knowledge of the issues. And if you don't, I have some suggestions in a minute that we'll get to. I'm going to talk faster because we have a few minutes left. I think when you're formulating an assessment, it's like, where is the individual at in their own process of orientation? What are the cultural, religious, racial, and age, ability, geography? If you live in a rural area, it's much more challenging than if you live in an urban area. That needs to be assessed. What is the individual at risk for violence at home, at school, or in their community? Those are important factors to consider. What are the salient family issues you're dealing with? Can you assume a neutral stance? Can you be gender neutral in saying things like, not to a girl, do you have a boyfriend, or to a boy, do you have a girlfriend, but do you have someone special in your life? That's really important. The neutral stance. Again, when I worked with young people, they would say sometimes to me, I'm sure you feel bad that I'm not gay. And I'd say, no, I have no vested interest in whether you're gay or not. That's up to you. My job is to work with you to help you be a healthy adult and to thrive. So I'm neutral. How can you facilitate or impede this process yourself with your own knowledge and your own kind of cues that you put out there? It's not your role to get them to come out to you. If the individual feels safe and are ready, they will come out to you. And if they don't, despite what you have done, they will not. You got to allow for ambiguity, be where the client is at, assure confidentiality. That's a really big one. You know, you are not going to pick up the phone and call the parents after that and say, I just want to let you know that I met with Mary today and she disclosed that she is lesbian. Are you aware of that? Absolutely, positively the wrong approach. The right approach would be to talk with Mary about who knows, to talk with Mary about who she wants to know, and to talk with Mary about how can you help facilitate her own disclosure when she's ready to disclose. The business of getting them to come out, that's not our job. Our job is to create a safe environment for them to talk with you about where they're at. I'm sorry that my slides are acting crazy. Individual and group interventions work best. Use bibliotherapy in your office. Give them printed material, printed out from being online. That's really important. Work on with families as well. Whoops, I'm sorry. That's really critical. Kids don't live by themselves. They live with families. So please do work with their families. These are a couple of suggestions. Acknowledge that you have LGBTQ people that are clients. Educate yourself and your coworkers about the reality of LGBTQ people. There's a lot of mythology, but educate them to the reality. Try to use gender neutral language. Using the actual words gay, lesbian, bi, trans, questioning in appropriate context is so important. They're listening for you to say one or many of those words. Never in the question of, are you gay? Are you a lesbian? Again, the wrong approach. You kind of have to say, and especially if young people say things to you like, I need to tell you something, I'm sure you know already, but I need to let you know, I kind of like boys like that. You know what I mean? You always have to say, well, I think I might know what you mean, but why don't you tell me a little bit more about that? Because it might mean something different. So I think that's important as well. Have literature or other visible signs in your waiting room or office that speaks to creating an LGBTQ affirming environment. You can print out a pink triangle, which is a symbol of gay or lesbian identity and pride, from the computer and put it in your office. You can put it on your bulletin board. You can put it on your door. There are these great little signs that say, you know, displaying this sign means that you're an LGBTQ ally, which I think is really important. And again, young people are looking for those visible signs. If a client discloses to you that they are gay, lesbian, bi, or trans, talk about it. The next question should be, tell me a little, first of all, thank you for sharing that information with me. And second is, tell me a little bit more about what that means to you. Tell me a little bit more about why today you chose to talk about that. And it's not an opportunity for them to do all the teaching to you, because that's not really what they should be doing. We should be doing our own homework. It's good that they talk to you and it's good that they share their experience, but their job is not to educate you all about LGBTQ people. It's really the work of the worker to do that themselves. Not all LGBTQ folks need to be referred to counseling immediately. If you are an LGBTQ professional and you feel it's safe to come out, come out. It's a really important thing that we're visible. If you are cisgender-oriented professional, be an ally for young people who are LGBTQ. Don't confuse transgender identity and gay, lesbian, or bisexual identity, very different things. And research resources that are in the community for your young people, where you're not gonna be able to do everything. I have a couple of resources here that are phenomenal. This is one of the best organizations I've ever known. The Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, pflag.org. It is a phenomenal organization. They're all over the country. That's the website. Look them up. They're just great. They have a great website. They have great things you can print out. I can't recommend them highly enough. The Trevor Project is a suicide prevention and training for LGBT youth. We didn't really talk about some of those high risk factors, but LGBTQ young people are up to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their cisgender counterparts. Very high stats, you know, very scary. Important that you call the hotline well, and they do have a great website. Is the Gay and Lesbian Straight Education Network, glisten.org. It's all about school stuff. There's lots of things that happen in schools. And this is a great project called the Family Project at San Francisco State University. They have this book that you can download all about how important it is that families engage with young people. There's incredible statistics about when one family member helps a young LGBTQ young person or supports them, the incidence of suicidality and high-risk behaviors and depression go way, way down because of that one person in the family. So worthwhile looking at. These are a couple of references, and yes, I am hawking my own books. This one is called LGBTQ Youth Issues. I wrote it a couple of years ago. It's really basic. It has a lot of basic information. You can find it from CWLA Press at cwla.org. It's the 3rd edition. I wrote it 3 times. I had to keep changing it every like 8 years because it kind of has things that we need to look at differently. This is another one, sorry for the terrible picture, but social work practice, it's a little bit broader. It's about families and young people and lots of other groups, and it's worthwhile. I use it as a text in school, but it's a good resource. The last one's a wonderful book written by, not by me, by a colleague named Elijah Neely, Trans Kids and Teens, Pride, Joy, and Families in Transition. A really great book. And as I said, I think the experiences of transgender young people are very qualitatively different. And I think it's really important that we start to look at that. Wow, I am exactly at 40 minutes. I put my little timer on. That's my email address. That's my name. I'm going to leave that for you. If you want to communicate with me directly, and I'm happy to communicate with folks. I try to get back to folks as quickly as I can when you do email me. So please do. And I hope this was useful. I know it was quick. And there's opportunities, we think, to do some other things that are a little bit more in depth.
I was wondering, when you were talking about the feeling of safety, that it's a big issue. Are there any differences, gender differences in the feelings of safety between lesbian and gays, and different reactions to lesbian versus gays? Families' reaction and things like this?
Oh, yeah. You know, I mean, I'll just share with you from my own research. I mean, when I did some research with gay and lesbian young people in the foster care system, I didn't even talk about sexual violence. And every young woman that I talked to talked about sexual violence that was perpetrated by either their family or people in the foster care system towards them. It was really horrifying. And I think that, you know, kind of the way in which verbal harassment and violence is perpetrated towards women versus men is a little bit different. So yeah, I would say there are qualitative differences. It's not like, oh, gay boys get harassed more than lesbian girls. It depends on where they are. I heard many different things as I was, you know, working in this area, but I don't think I can give you anything specific like, oh, it was more difficult for girls than it was for boys. It was difficult for both of them. I mean, I think that, you know, 2 girls holding hands is not a really big deal, but I have a really good friend who says, yeah, but 2 lesbians holding hands is very different than 2 girls who are just friends at a dance, you know? So there are some differences like that, but I think the reality is that LGBTQ young people and trans young people have incredible incidents of violence as well, are constantly scanning their environment for safety. And not just like late at night when you're walking in the street. I mean, in school, at the doctor's office, you know, at home, you know, just going to the movies. And again, I think it's just a reality where young people, unfortunately, are constantly scanning their environment all the time for that. Even in New York City, which is a very, you know, liberal city. My partner and I, on our own block, sometimes have people yelling at us if we're walking holding hands. You know, and, you know, the yelling at you can ignore, but it could escalate into something else. And, you know, I'm not a teenager, but, you know, as a teenager, that can be really, really horrifying and scary. And sometimes teenagers will say things back and then it escalates more quickly. So it's a reality. And it's something that young people and people who work with young people have to be very aware of. And even in their own family.
Thank you.
Would demisexuality and sapiosexuality fall under the heading of sexual fluidity?
Yes, but to be really upfront and honest with you, those are 2 terms that are changing so much that I can't even really define them for you. I mean, if I looked them up, I could, but yeah, it's part of that whole fluidity. And again, language and kind of the way in which people are identifying is changing so much that those are two other terms that young people are using as well. And maybe next PowerPoint, I'll make sure to define them as well.
Awesome, thank you. Any thoughts on books for young people who are LGBTQ and self-esteem or depression?
Oh, there's lots of stuff. I mean, I would say the best thing is to just go on like Amazon.com. I mean, there are so many books and they break it down for you really nicely. And you just can't even keep up with them anymore. What I do when I go on Amazon is I look at like the last like 5 to 10 most recent books. And then if there's somebody who's really well known in an area, I'll look at some of their books. But to give you titles would be not worth it because they change so much and there's so much that's going on out there as well. I read a really great book about trans teens talk about their experiences. You know, there's a really great little book from a transgender perspective about this young gal named Jazz, who has a TV show. And she wrote a little book, and she has a children's book, actually, that's beautiful. But those are just two that pop off the top of my head. There's many, many other ones.
Thank you. The next question is, any thoughts on children with attachment disorders or teens/young adults who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder who may present as gay or bisexual? Any connection in these two?
I don't think there's any connection in them being LGBTQ and those disorders. I think it's quite possible that young people who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder or attachment disorder can also be LGBTQ. So it's just like, even from a developmental disabilities perspective and autism spectrum disorder, and those are not my areas of expertise per se, but those young people can also identify as gay, lesbian, bi, trans, questioning, or gender sexually fluid. So its reality is that, yeah, it could be anybody.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for young social workers to address issues of supervisors not affirming a client's identity? That's a great question.
That's a really good question. You know, I almost want to start off by saying, if anybody doesn't get this at this point in time, too bad. You need to get it. You know, and that would be probably what I would say to a supervisor, not so nicely. But I mean, it's ridiculous at this point in time that you have people who are in our profession who will say things like, I just don't get it. It's like, really? Come on. There's always been lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people, and there always will be. Like, what don't you get? Go read a book. Go watch a YouTube video. You know, go to a training. I mean, and if it's all wrapped up in your own, like, religious stuff or your own, you know, cultural stuff, you know, those are personal beliefs. And as a social work professional, we're bound by ethics and values of the profession. And I think you really need to bring people back to that. I do training, and I've done a bunch of policy work in the state of Louisiana. Now, the lady who's the commissioner is a good friend of mine, which I'm very happy with. But, you know, what she basically said is, we're going to make changes here in Louisiana. And we did. We changed every policy and everything that related to LGBTQ young people in the foster care system. And then I went out and did training. I did clinical case consultation. I didn't have one problem because the leader said, we're going to do this. And then everybody kind of followed suit. So I think it's very challenging when you're a young student and your supervisor doesn't have this knowledge. And it's not always age-based, although it can be. I mean, as I age myself, I realize there are things that take me a little while longer to get than I used to be able to get. But I think, you know, it's unsettling that we still have people in the profession who don't, you know, it's not that they don't get it. They don't want to get it. So there's a difference between that. You can tell I don't have any feelings about this at all.
The next question is, I noticed we didn't speak about people with intersex reproductive organs. Is it incorrect to apply them under the LGBTQ umbrella?
Wow. You have a very knowledgeable audience out there. You know, in 40 minutes, there was only so much I could talk about, and I had intersex people under one of the categories, and I eliminated it because I thought I can't get into that. Yes, what you know, in that LGBTQ group, people are now adding IA, intersexed, asexual. Those are two other communities that are sometimes brought into that umbrella. I think the reality of intersex people are qualitatively different in some ways than being gay, lesbian, bi, or trans, and yet there are some similarities. But again, it would probably be better to look at some of those issues from the perspective of, you know, what are the challenges and the wonderful things that intersex folks bring to people, and how do workers need to address those issues.
Do you believe that the word partner should be used for anyone so that no one has to defend their sexuality, or is husband and wife still acceptable?
Oh, I mean, some people use husband and wife. I mean, I'm married legally, and I call my husband my husband. If I wasn't married, I probably would say he's my partner. I've used both. I think that people have to use what they feel comfortable with. I get a little thrown when cisgender people start talking about their partner, and I'm like, oh, you know, it's funny. It kind of had been associated with LGBTQ people so much that when somebody who wasn't LGBTQ started talking about partner, it was like, it threw me off. But I mean, my feeling is people need to use what they feel comfortable using. And there's no real guidelines for people to do that. They shouldn't have to feel like they need to defend it, but they should be comfortable using whatever they feel fits their relationship best.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Gary? Oh, here it is. One just popped up. Do you have any suggestions for leaders to create a more open environment for their LGBTQ employees? Oh, yeah. I actually wrote a chapter in one of my books about transforming your environment to be more LGBTQ oriented for workers or for staff. I mean, there's a bunch of things that people need to do. I mean, I used to get consultation around, especially for trans people who were transitioning, where their colleagues went nuts because, like, a person who was assigned male at birth has now transitioned to be affirmed as female and wanted to use the women's restroom. Oh my God, it caused a huge issue. But the issue is that you need to talk about those things. And it's not just the responsibility of the trans person to talk about it, it's the responsibility of the organization to say, here's what we espouse, here's what we think, and here's how we're gonna deal with this. I mean, even the whole idea about gender neutral bathrooms. I mean, at Hunter, I think we came up with a pretty good solution. We have like a 8-story building, and like, you know, one floor is male and one floor is gender neutral and one floor is female and the next floor is gender neutral and the next floor is male. So that there's options that people have for using bathrooms, but it's not all just about bathrooms. It's about lots of things. And it's really the responsibility and the obligation of the organization to take on defining those issues and talking about how their organization is going to deal with sexual orientation and gender identity issues, even for something like healthcare insurance or family leave or all those other things. They really need to think about that. I appreciate Haruv for inviting me, and thank you all for moderating and such. I'm kind of new to Zoom. This is only my second Zoom, but it's very smooth. And I just think the issues are so critical and so important, and people just need to do their own homework. There's so much out there. One little thing I'd like to throw out there is that I often say, you know, it's your job to go out and do the work, but, you know, that sometimes we need a cultural guide. So, like, if you have a good friend who's gay or a good friend who's trans or a good friend who's a lesbian, and you can ask them some questions that help you do this and understand this better, you should do that with their permission and their level of comfort. And it doesn't mean that their experience is everyone's experience, but I think having a cultural guide like that is just so important. I know I used to live in an Orthodox Jewish community in New York. I guess this is appropriate, speaking about Haruv. And not that everybody's Orthodox, but I didn't understand what my neighbors sometimes did on the Sabbath because I'm not Jewish. And I was not appropriate on the Sabbath to ask them either. But when it wasn't the Sabbath, I would ask them. And my neighbor was a guy named Ed, and he was my cultural guide. So I would ask Ed all of these questions that I had, not on the Sabbath, because I was his, what they called Sabbath goy. He would come to my house on Saturday when they needed something. He'd stand in front of my house. He wasn't even allowed to ask me to help him. I didn't know that. One of my students told me that. And I would just follow him into his house and like turn off the oven or turn off the lights or do something. But I use that as an example because I think it's wonderful to have that kind of relationship with somebody when it's respectful and when it's, you know, not on their Sabbath day, to say, hey, I just don't understand what this is. Can you tell me so that I know and I can be more competent in the future when these things happen? And I think with gay, lesbian, bi, and trans issues, it's really important to have that cultural guide. So
feel free. I've done it many times for people when they send me emails, and I'm happy to answer anybody's email question if they have something that they don't want to ask out loud and they want to email me as well. So anyway, thank you so much. Pleasure to do this.